So when done thoroughly and correctly, a trust-based approach, it helps to move towards a more equitable sector. It does in the practices, the culture assessment, but it's not explicitly identical to racial equity work. And we've heard questions around that. We've heard conflations, confusion. And so that's part of what we really want to express and make sure it's understood that trust-based philanthropy as an approach is not explicitly racial equity work, but it does require a racial equity lens. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But before we jump into that, I do want to jump into the distinctions, the similarities and the distinctions. And I won't dig too much into trust-based philanthropy, its definition, because we've been talking about that throughout this entire series. We have plenty of resources, but it really is that work to shift the sector, to prioritize power shifting, to advance equity, to build those mutually accountable relationships. And it's important in a trust-based approach to understand the ways that philanthropic practices, the way we operate, the way we work as a sector, how that harms communities. Understanding certain funder actions and practices and ways of being, and how that may harm the communities, the grantees that we're aiming to serve and to support. Trust-based philanthropy is a framework, of course, and it's also a mindset. It's a way of thinking and operating. Trust-based philanthropy, one of the facets is to lead with trust, to start with trust rather than distrusting your grantees, the community, to lead with trust. And we had a previous session in this series that spoke on what that looks like. We talk a lot about that relationship priority. This is a relational approach. We're lifting up ways to build stronger relationships between funders and grantees. And it really gets at that funder value practice gap. There's a gap between the practices funders, the values that funders say they have, and how that is actually implemented, the practices that actually funders carry out. And then we also believe that trust-based philanthropy, a lot of the power imbalance, because of a lot of the power imbalance, the onus is on funders to make these shifts as the ones that hold that power. And then on the other side of things, racial equity is a goal. It's also a movement. Racial equity is very complex. Of course, as we mentioned before, there's way more than we could cover in this brief session, but it really looks at addressing and understanding and eliminating those disparities and improving outcomes, particularly for those that have been marginalized and disenfranchised. And it looks at the continual, the changing policies, practices, systems, and structures that we have at play, both as a larger society and in our sector. And so some of the facets of that include it being important to understand the ways that systems and practices have harmed and are harming people of color, particularly Black and Indigenous people of color. This is also a goal and a mindset. It's a goal towards a more racially equitable sector in society. And so it's also a mindset. It's something that you could embed through all of your practices, processes, and all sorts of things you do. In a racial equity journey, trust may not be prioritized and it may never be achieved, especially when you consider all of the harms and injustices that have been done to marginalized racial identities. Maybe trust will never be the end goal, and it never will be achieved in a racial equity approach. Racial equity work is informed by demographics, understanding the data around the populations and the identities that are represented, that are supported, and those that aren't. And it requires scaffolded interventions. And when I lift up scaffolded interventions, I'm sure a lot of us have seen this image and maybe a longer one with justice and all of the other components of that. But when we think about what equity is and how it's defined, it means that certain populations that need more support get more support. It's not that everybody gets the same amount of support. It's that those that needed more get that. And so I thought this image would be great to really tie that scaffolded intervention component of racial equity work And then the onus is on everyone in the racial equity approach. Everybody from wherever you're seated, whatever identities you have, can be on this journey and can find ways to bring others along and to lift up racial equity, lift up ways to be more equitable and to support marginalized identities, racial identities. And then when we look at both, there are a lot of similarities around both the trust-based approach and the racial equity approach. Both, of course, are working towards a vision of liberty and equity for the larger sector, for the larger society and for our sector. Both aim to address those inequities. They complement and rely on each other, which we'll talk about in just a moment, how they're interrelated. And both require both internal work, looking at your organization's culture, your practices, your hiring, your staff makeup, but then also that external work of looking at the communities you serve, who you're granting to, who you're not granting to, your strategic priorities and how those play out, how you're engaging with external constituents. And then for both processes, there's no universal approach. There's no one size fits all. A racial equity journey at one organization is going to look different than another one, and vice versa for trust-based philanthropy. So yeah. So as I mentioned, trust-based philanthropy and racial equity are complementary. I mean, we talk a lot about this racial equity lens. In the trust-based approach, it is important to have that racial equity lens. And when I say a racial equity lens, I mean examining everything that you're doing and the ways you operate with racial equity in mind. So everything from examining the bias you may have internally in your organizations and your grant-making practices, to thinking about ways to uplift marginalized voices, to including others in the processes you do across the grant-making life cycle, across your organizational life cycle, through everything that you're doing, considering how racial equity can be uplifted, because there are ways for it to be ingrained across all of your processes. So this lens really helps not to perpetuate the same inequities. So if you're doing a trust-based approach, but you're still only serving those folks that you trust, those folks that aren't from racially disenfranchised identities, then you're perpetuating the same inequities. You're only serving those that are not being harmed by the system. This lens also helps to reduce that bias that I talked about and the harm to those that are most marginalized, to those that aren't getting the support from philanthropy, to those that are being disenfranchised by the sector. And it helps to acknowledge and right-size the lack of trust that Shadi was talking about, the lack of philanthropic trust towards BIPOC organizations and leaders. And then in a racial equity journey, trust-based philanthropy is a useful tool. So this is a tool that helps to give a framework and a language to operationalizing equity. So when you're on that racial equity journey and you're learning about the history of the sector and society and the ways that, foundations have perpetuated harm, then you can use trust-based philanthropy as a tool to right size and to fix and to address some of those injustices that that you learn about. And it also helps to shift that data to action. So when you're learning about those data pieces, trust-based philanthropy is a whole framework. Of course, there's so many resources and ways that you can understand to operationalize this work. And it helps to address those power imbalances that we talked about between funders and grantees, grant seekers. It helps to address the value practice gap and all of those unnecessary requirements that we often make grantees do to reduce the harm that we're perpetuating towards them. So we encourage you to think of trust-based philanthropy as a means to an end. If your destination is a more just, equitable sector and society, trust-based philanthropy can be a vehicle for racial equity work. When you're on your racial equity journey, you're looking at things through this racial equity, if you're practicing trust-based philanthropy through this racial equity lens, this is a way for you to operationalize this work So I encourage you all to reflect on your entry point and where you are, where your organization stands in this work.